Hello, my name is Sarah and welcome back to my channel. Today I am bringing you the top 6 books of 2022 so far. I was looking around on YouTube and I saw all of the mid-year freakout tags and I wanted to do something similar, but answering all of those questions would take forever, and so many people have done that I knew it would be not very likely that you guys would be interested in seeing something like that again. So I decided to just pick my top books for every month that I've read so far. So from January to June, I'll tell you what my favorite book each of those months were, and that will kind of give you an idea of what my favorite books of 2022 so far have been, and it shouldn't take nearly as long as answering all of the questions on that tag. So without further ado, let's get started. I have my notebook here, my cheat sheet of the books that I have read so far, and I went through my Goodreads and found the books that I gave 5 stars to, and for some months, most months, I have multiple 5-star books. I had to narrow it down between those 5 stars for the ones that were my absolute favorite, so it was a little hard to just pick one, and I will at the very end name a few honorable mentions that didn't make like my top 6 but were really, really good. In January, I read 4 5-star books, but the book that took the cake for me in January was Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. This was not the first Brandon Sanderson that I've ever read. I have read the first 3 Stormlight Archive books, but I am beginning at the start with his Cosmia and trying to read books in an order that is recommended for reading his books because they're all connected in some way. Not necessarily that you have to read them in order, but it's fun too because then you'll be able to see those connections easier. This book, oh my gosh, it's so good. So essentially Elantris is a city that used to house the gods. Essentially, they were people who were incredibly powerful, had incredibly powerful magic, when all of a sudden they started to turn into zombies. They became sick with a sickness and their bodies just lingered and lingered and lingered and their minds went mad, and so the people in the town surrounding the city locked the city, built this giant wall around it, and the people who live there are essentially dead, but they're not dead, they're the undead. And in the beginning of the story, a very important political figure in this area ends up falling ill and getting thrown into Elantris, and so we're following his point of view inside Elantris. He's trying to make the lives of the people better. He's trying to encourage them to remember their humanity, and there's also a lot of different kinds of political intrigue. I have not read a book with an ending that gave me such a visceral emotional reaction in a really long time. Like, I wanted to throw the book, I was yelling, I was completely in this book, but oh my gosh, the ending. And Brandon Sanderson is known for his amazing, like, punch you in the gut endings, so this was amazing. February was Blackathon and it was Polarthon. I had 5 5-star reads in February, so it was kind of hard to choose what my favorite book was, but I ended up choosing A Phoenix Must Burn, and this was edited by Patrice Caldwell. And this is a collection of science fiction fantasy stories written by Black authors with Black protagonists, and a lot of them are politically charged racially. At the time that I read this, I was definitely concerned about the things that were happening in the world and the racism and the prejudice and things that are happening in the United States right now. And so I was so excited to be participating in Blackathon and to be supporting Black authors and reading Black stories and just trying to understand that viewpoint a little bit better, because obviously it's an experience that I have never had. I generally don't like short stories. I usually gravitate towards like the biggest, thickest fantasy science fiction novels that you can find in the library, but these stories were absolutely beautiful. There wasn't a single story that I disliked. There were some that I liked a lot better than others, but as far as the cohesiveness of this and the heart behind every single one of these stories, there was not a single one that I disliked. So I would highly, highly recommend reading this. In March, I read a book that you guys have seen me talk about a lot now, and that is A Dark and Hollow Star. This was by far my favorite book in March. I had apparently 7 5-star reads in March, which is astounding to me. Apparently March was an amazingly good month, but this was the book that has stuck with me since, and I'm reading the sequel right now, so I am thinking about this book a lot. This is a queer fae fantasy. It is following the story of a Fury who was banished from the immortal world into the mortal world, and also the story of a fae who has not started showing her powers yet, and her father is human, and so there's a lot of prejudice against what they call iron bloods, people who are a combination of fae and human. And so it's these two stories intertwining and a greater plot to take over the politics of the fae world, and the immortals want to come back after they've been banished away from the mortal realm, and there's a lot going on. So many characters, so many different settings, so many different players that are vying for power. It kind of reminds me of Game of Thrones in that sense, just the scope of the characters and all of their different motivations and not really knowing what their motivations are. The iron blood in the community are being murdered, and usually they're children. They're for ages like 13 to 19, and nobody's doing anything about it because nobody cares. And so these two main characters are trying to figure out what's going on. There are several queer romances taking place in this story. It is really, really well written. I absolutely loved it, and I would highly recommend it. In April, I had 5 5-star reads. I actually took the book that I read to my classroom, so I don't have it with me, so I'll put a picture right here. But it's Fish in a Tree by Lynda Mullaly Hunt. This book, if you watched my vlog while I was reading it, like ripped out my heart and tore it into pieces, and I cried the entire time I was reading it. It was so beautifully done. This is the story about a young girl who is in middle school. I think she's in 6th grade, and she's gone through her whole life without anybody realizing that she can't read. She's in school and she can't read, and so she's acting out. She's learned how to use her behavior to get her out of having to do assignments and to have the focus be on her behavior so that the adults around her just never realized she couldn't read. She has dyslexia, and it was undiagnosed her entire life. The voice of this young child in this book is so well done, and I could hear the voices of my own students through her, and the relationship that she ends up building with this teacher who finally realizes the struggle that she's going through and does the research and understands how to help her is just so beautiful. And of course it would be close to my heart as a teacher of that age group. So I am a little biased in my love for this book, but it is 100% my top favorite book of that month, and one of my top from the entire year. In May, I only had 2 5-star reads, so it was not a great month. It was the month that I decided to read all of these thriller books, but they were really hit and miss for me. I prefer more of like horror stories than thriller mystery, I discovered during this endeavor. But I did find a 5-star read, and that was The Silent Patient by Michaelides. This book was so well written. I found it really spooky, and the ending completely caught me off guard. I have seen a show that has kind of a similar vibe as this, but I still didn't see it coming. And I don't know if that was just because I was willingly not like thinking critically about it, because I've heard some people have very like negative reviews of this book and say that they saw it coming, that they didn't like the character, blah blah blah. But I was in love with this book when I read it. It totally blew my mind and left me breathless. Like I was just like thinking about it for days after I read this book. So essentially, there is a woman who has committed murder. Her husband is dead, and they found her over his body with the weapon, but she never said a word afterwards. Completely silent, never said anything, and it's been years and years. So they put her in an insane asylum instead of prison because of the fact that she's not speaking, and it shows that she is mentally unstable. And this therapist, he's a psychologist therapist, he has decided that he wants to go and work with her and see if he can get her to talk and open up about what happened with her husband and the whole situation that happened. So it gets very dark, it gets very twisty. Highly recommend it. And finally, book number 6, my favorite from June and my favorite of the whole year so far, has been Tilly and the Bookwanderers. This is a Pages & Co. novel. There are very many of them. It's the first book that I've picked up of hers, and I absolutely fell in love with this story. This is the story of Tilly. She lives in a bookstore with her grandparents, and her mom has gone missing years before. Her dad, she has no idea who he is. And in the beginning of the story, she starts hearing her grandparents talking to people, and then when she comes up to them, they're gone. The people are gone. But she overhears these conversations, and if you're a book lover, you realize before she does that her grandparents are talking to characters from novels, their favorite characters. So it starts from there. Tilly's favorite characters start jumping out of her book, and she has to navigate this new crazy world that she is discovering is real in her bookstore. So it's really, really sweet. I love the language. I love how the title of every single chapter is embedded in the story itself. I love the little illustrations in the story. I love the characters. I love the friendships and the relationships between her and her grandparents and her parents and all of the things and the twisty mystery that comes about in this story. The world that it's built in, the idea of your favorite characters coming out of the novels. I love everything about this book, and I'm so excited because I recently purchased the next 2 in the series. So I'm going to be doing a vlog of that for sure. So that's it for my top 6. I did have a couple of honorable mentions that I couldn't go without saying that I loved them so much this year so far. And that the first one would be The Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. This is the second and final book of the Strange the Dreamer duology. This is the story of a magical place where people with blue skin were considered gods, and there was a war in the past. They had treated the humans very terribly, and the remaining children who had survived the massacre of the gods live in a temple kind of hovering above the city. And Strange the Dreamer, he was brought to the city to try and help figure out how to get this giant god temple away from their city and moving on from the gods. And it becomes very complicated when it's discovered that there are still children of the gods living above their city. But this author, I think, is probably one of my new favorite authors of all time because I am in love with the way she tells her stories. I am in love with the language that she uses. It's so beautiful and dreamy, and her descriptions are amazing. I love her writing style. And manga that I picked up this year that I fell in love with 100% was Magus of the Library. There are 5 volumes so far. The 6th one is coming out in December, and it is actually kind of similar to the story of Strange the Dreamer, but this young boy is so in love with books, and his main goal for his life is to travel to this famous library that is miles and miles away and become a librarian, this esteemed career of being a librarian and a caretaker of books. And I loved it. I love the magic in the world. I love the pure joy of reading and books that emanates from the pages of these mangas. They're so good. So if you're a book lover and enjoy manga, definitely try this one out. And then finally, the last book that I had to give an honorable mention to was Friedrich Bachmann's My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry. It was actually the most surprising book, I think, of the year for me so far, because I have kind of avoided reading his books because of the hype, but because I wasn't sure that they were really my thing. I didn't know that I was going to like them, but I finally picked up this one that I've had on my shelf forever, and it was the most wholesome, beautiful, sad, heartbreaking book that I had read in a very long time. And I cried, and I laughed, and I fell in love with the characters in that story. So I was proven wrong, and I found that I absolutely love that story as well. So yes, there you have it. Hopefully short and sweet. I wanted to give you guys just a rundown of what I've read so far, my favorites of the year, and let me know in the comments down below if you've read any of the books that I mentioned, if you have any recommendations for me of books that I should read based on what I've told you were my favorite this year so far. And I am so happy that you clicked on my channel. Thank you so much for supporting me. Thank you for the likes and the comments. I really appreciate it. So I will be signing off now, but I will see you in the next one. Take care.